How do you balance velocity versus maintainability in a code base? Find a way to make them the same thing, because if you build code that is built in a way that it's easy to understand and maintain, then your velocity always stays high. The fastest code bases in terms of turnaround were the ones where everything was built in a way that it had these like really clear API boundaries. And you could call this microservices, you could call this, packages, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately each thing had like clear APIs and docs around those APIs, so that when you were working, you didn't have to think about the feature through the whole system. You just had to think up to the API boundary. And as long as what you were building kept the API contracts true, you didn't have to go and like fix the whole code base or understand the whole code base to implement a feature. And that makes you fast. By thinking about how to not let those things leak, and by building code that is written for maintainability, which means it's easy to delete, it's easy to replace, hot swap something and nobody even notices. Like if you build all of your backend APIs in Go and the API surface is being used by a website that isn't going to be maintained, but you realize that you've actually got this like performance bottleneck, so you're going to swap out one of these endpoints to be in Rust so that you can solve something. As long as the API contract stays true, it's going to accept these parameters and return this data. You can just kind of flip that switch and nothing else needs to know and nothing else needs to care. It just continues to function, and now that performance bottleneck goes away because you re-architected the thing and redeployed it, but with the same API contracts. So that's building for maintainability, but it's also building for velocity, because now that team, they only have one set of things they have to keep true. If the API stays accurate, nothing can reach into its internals and touch things. So you don't have to worry that like changing this line of code is going to break the whole code base. You're not worried about like end-to-end testing. You can be really intentional, saying like this code only touches itself except for these API endpoints that are out there. Right? Otherwise, these internal calls are all private. They can't be accessed from anywhere else. There's no way for some other piece of code to reach beyond the API boundary and rely on an internal. So you can destroy it with impunity. I think maintainability needs to be considered a feature of velocity, because I think if you treat them as separate things and you say, I'm going to build really fast and make a big pile of mess, and later we'll come back and spend time cleaning up the mess so that we can continue to go fast, what ends up happening is inevitably your velocity informs the rest of the team how fast something can go. And if you are going really fast and then you say, okay, but now we're going to stop shipping for 6 months or 6 weeks so that we can focus on cleaning up debt, and everybody goes, okay, but that means we're not creating any value, right? So you have to make the maintainability part of the velocity so that it continues to be the value. I am spending the time to architect this properly and write the docs because it means that we always ship really fast. Treat maintainability as a facet of velocity as opposed to a separate component of a code base. Then it tends to change the questions that you ask. You're no longer saying like, when will we come back and clean this up? But instead you're saying, are we willing to take that future slowdown to ship this now? And usually the answer is no. Take the extra day and fix it, because you can see the compound slowdown, and you can always watch this happen in big companies that don't pay attention to this, where they're like shipping, growing, and then they slow down, and then you don't hear from them anymore. And suddenly you're like, whatever happened to that company? Like, they used to be so on top of it. But yeah, try to make them the same thing.